Coming up, the New York Football Giants officially kick off their offseason now that the Kansas City Chiefs have once again taken down the championship. We dive in on some key takeaways from the big game and also the critical decisions in creating cap space and potentially targeting a quarterback at the number 6 overall spot. We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends. It is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where we are your host. Over here, Adam Arbrecht. Over there, Andrew Makowitz. Plenty to talk about when it comes to the New York Football Giants is, well, whether it's the official start of the 2024-2025 season or not, it is. It now becomes that because there's no more football to play here. Before we dive in, though, Andy, big takeaways. In the old, as Andy says, and many would say, you never bet against Patrick Mahomes. Chiefs take it down on an overtime game-winning drive late last night. A Super Bowl first time in Vegas. Were you overall pleased by that game in terms of slow first half? Maybe took a little while to get revved up, but ended up being a really good game in the end.
Yeah, it felt like the first half, it was a lot of the teams feeling each other out. It felt like there was a lot of punts, and it didn't feel like anybody was really in a rhythm. But yeah, I mean, you said it at the top of the show. It's something that I have believed in all playoffs, which is just don't bet against Patrick Mahomes. Now, the interesting thing in all of this was I expected Patrick Mahomes to be great in when the situation dictated that it needed greatness, but I also expected Brock Purdy for the moment to be too big for him. And that wasn't the case. I thought Brock Purdy played fairly well. Like, he had a 60 something QBR. He looked to be moving the ball down the field and getting it into playmakers' hands. That was actually the bigger surprise to me, was not that Patrick Mahomes did what Patrick Mahomes does and come up clutch in big situations. It was more, I'm surprised that Brock Purdy was able to do what he was able to do. Overall, solid game, was pretty happy with it. Pretty funny that all the San Francisco 49ers, though, came out and were like, yeah, we had no idea what the new overtime rules were. And meanwhile, the Chiefs are like, we have already planned for this since the start of training camp. It was just another like weird thing for Kyle Shanahan and the 49ers, like egg on your face type of situation.
Yeah, I really thought that overall the coaching staff for the Chiefs, right? I think that they adjusted better over the course of this game, right? Steve Spagnuolo now 4 championships as a defensive coordinator in the NFL. The ebb and flow of this game, you just wait for that moment. You wait for one run up the gut after the 49ers defense looked electric to start the half. Obviously, Greenlaw goes down like they suffered. And then you saw also Deebo Samuel struggling with his hamstring, already dealing with the shoulder. A couple of key injuries on both sides of the ball for them. But that one moment late in the game where it's, oh, you've contained him so well. You haven't allowed him to escape the pocket. Bosa has stayed so disciplined. And when you saw that middle of the field open up, you're like, well, this is just the one time you can't afford to have it happen. But in the end, I think coaching played a big role in this. I don't really care that much about the 49ers choosing to take the ball first in overtime. I know you say, oh, I want that. He dismissed the idea about the defense being tired, which I took into account in my mind. But I don't know if it matters. It's so results oriented. You go down, you score a touchdown, then you say, well, yeah, it was a great idea. You don't, you kick the field goal. All of those things kind of tumble here. But in the end, it came down to what is arguably the better team in terms of totality in the 49ers, just not being able to make a couple of the critical plays. And honestly, blocked field goal, extra point attempt that was kicked off his ankle. Like these things go by the wayside here in a lot of ways when we talk about this game. And then also the punt. It goes off the teammate's foot. He tries to recover it. That loose scramble there, right? There's a lot of moments in this game that go well beyond just who the players were, which is a good thing. I think it's great that you said Brock Purdy played a good game. Like nothing to take away from any of the performances by San Francisco. It's just don't bet against Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid, right? And Andy Reid ultimately.
Yeah, of course. What's fascinating is they do it. It's the talking point after someone like Patrick Mahomes wins the Super Bowl. They look at how much the running back makes. And Isaiah Pacheco is a 7th round draft pick. He's making next to the league minimum. And he compromised about 0.4% of the total cap for the Kansas City Chiefs. And, we were obviously talking about this pre-show, but it's fascinating where it's like, you see this and you're like, oh, wow, in the last 10 years, only one person has had more than 1.5%. And that was Marshawn Lynch for the Seattle Seahawks. But you brought up a good point that like, there are 2 teams that are playing in the Super Bowl, and they seem to have been built differently than each other.
Oh, of course, right? You look over and you see Christian McCaffrey, and he makes a ton of money, right? And so the models, and we talked about this in the offseason as we're going to get into for the Giants and the decisions that they need to make and whether or not they're already on the wrong path. But this idea that you have to have, I can paint a picture where Brock Purdy, the 49ers make it to the Super Bowl this year, and it's anyone other than Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs, and they're going to win that. I can make the case that Patrick Mahomes, if you go ahead and say they take on any number of other teams, maybe they win by a lot more because most teams are not as well balanced as the 49ers are. So it's so circumstantial, but you make these choices. If you invest heavily in the quarterback, by the way, the Chiefs don't have elite wide receivers anymore, right? They have Travis Kelce, and you can't overlook him, but they don't have elite wide receivers anymore because it costs you more than just the running back. You mentioned a very low paid running back in Pacheco for the Chiefs. Yeah, and also low cost wide receivers, and also low cost this, low cost that. We highlighted how they invested more heavily on the defensive side of the ball after giving Patrick Mahomes his contract. And frankly, when you look at a game like this, you would say, even though it came down to a couple of critical Mahomes decisions and plays, that it was about the defense being able to consistently shut things down because other versions of this Chiefs team would not have been able to hold a 10-3 halftime deficit, right? A one possession game. And that to me, I remember at the time thinking, this could be a problem for the 49ers because even a less than offensively minded Chiefs team still has Patrick Mahomes and a better defense, and it adds up. It adds up in the end to a Chiefs win.
Patrick Mahomes had the largest cap hit in the entire NFL this year, which when that happens, you lose a lot of those weapons that you mentioned. On the other side, you have Brock Purdy making $1 million basically, and you're able to put assemble the team of Avengers around Brock
Right.
Purdy with paying Christian McCaffrey money, being able to go out and get Charvarius Ward, defensively. When the quarterback's making $1 million instead of a $40 million cap hit, like, I don't know, say the New York Giants have,
Right.
it is interesting how much talent you can really accumulate. Or you can go get a Chase Young who makes an impact play. You can go trade for Christian McCaffrey because you're not spending all that money on one player. The Giants have the issue of now they're already paying their potential franchise quarterback $40 million plus, and their most explosive offensive weapon is asking for $14 to $15 million. That to me is the only, you got to pick a lane here. You either got to go cheap with the quarterback or you have to have a transcendent quarterback. And I don't know if the Giants have either of those things going on at the moment.
And that's why both the 49ers, from player standpoint, and also the New York Football Giants should be over on Pietential, Pietential. It is, of course, the easy online, basically survey, 100% free for individual users that checks in on your well-being, sets benchmarks for you, and gives you methods to improve. Get over to pietential.com today to check it out. Something that, hey, maybe Kyle Shanahan will be looking into as he continues his offseason journey. I can't believe it was 4 years ago when the 49ers were last there. Like, it seemed like it was, 2 years ago. But no, 4 seasons to get back to that mountaintop. We'll talk about the 49ers in the offseason and how whether or not this thing is going to start to kind of come apart a little bit for them, even though they're odds-on favorites going into next year. Again, the Giants, Saquon Barkley. This is the problem because the model right now would be based on talent level that you should be paying Daniel Jones not a lot of money and then influxing with a ton of talent around him, wide receiver, running back, all these things. You should have a Saquon Barkley on this roster. But because you're paying him north of $40 million, you start to have to do this really delicate dance here when we talk about how much cap space they have and the areas that they feel like they want or need to invest in this offseason. Do you feel like no matter what, the Giants, Joe Schoen, are going to be second guessed about whatever decisions they make this offseason? Because it feels like the proof will be in the pudding when it comes to the schedule and winning or losing games.
Well, you mentioned the San Francisco 49ers go into next season as the odds-on favorite in Vegas to be able to get back to the Super Bowl and win the Super Bowl.
Of course.
When you look at the New York Giants, there's only one team that has longer odds than the New York Giants to win the Super Bowl next year. And what team, just for a bonus point, Adam, do you know what team that is?
Commanders?
It's the Carolina Panthers, actually.
Oh, that makes no sense. Yeah. Former Christian McCaffrey team.
Yeah, well, exactly, because they traded all that draft capital to move up, and they still don't know if they have their franchise quarterback.
That's right.
But, Adam, the reason why I highlight that is because the Giants are paying Daniel Jones as a franchise quarterback, and yet they have the second worst odds to win the Super Bowl. That means you're investing in a quarterback that no one else thinks is going to be, up there making deep playoff runs, things like that. And so, Adam, yes, of course, the second guessing is going to happen, especially not even knowing if Daniel Jones is going to be healthy. Does it feel to you a little bit that it almost helps Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll that Daniel Jones is coming off an injury? Because if he was fully healthy, like what the Giants would just say full steam ahead with Daniel Jones, and they would probably get more question marks. At least the injury allows them to like go out and make different moves potentially and not necessarily get judged for it.
Yeah, I don't know because he already had injury problems before they gave him the contract. See, that's a big part of it here. If last year, if he had basically been healthy and played the way he's played, he said, okay, some good years, some bad years, right? Some ups and downs. Team hasn't been good. Okay, we're building towards something. And then last year, he has this injury and go, oh my gosh, this is going to be really hard. We've lost a year of his development. So we really thought that he'd be a little bit further along before this money kicked in. It's not true. He has had multiple neck injuries. He has had lower body injuries. So now what you're really talking about is, were you diligent enough in the idea of this guy not even being talented enough, but being healthy enough to be your franchise guy going forward? So I don't know if it buys them that much goodwill. The other part of this is going to be, do they get bought goodwill around the fact that, and this is always so weird to say, well, is the team talented enough, right? Do they get goodwill because, okay, Daniel Jones may not be the greatest quarterback, but who is he playing with? And that's when we get to the cap room for this team and to the key decisions for this offseason. Because when you look right now, as it stands on over the cap, you go and you can find the New York Football Giants. They list them at $21.8 million in cap space. If you go by Spot Track, they have them up to nearly $26 million. There's some things that they need to make decisions about. A couple of critical pieces here are, one, when Joe Schoen came in, he made it very clear he doesn't want to push money out. He doesn't want to have dead money on the books. The only thing they have is a little over $10 million in dead cap from Leonard Williams because they converted that money to a bonus so they could go ahead and move him and pick up that second round pick. So he's cleaned up a lot of the mess from the Dave Gettleman era. Still doesn't have a ton to work with here, but now it comes down to at least two, in addition to Saquon Barkley in that decision, but at least two critical players on this roster right now that if he's willing to take a little bit more dead cap money, he can clear up nearly $15 million. And that's with, obviously, long talked about Mark Glowinski and then Darius Slayton as well.
Yeah, I mean, don't discount the decision that Joe Schoen has to make around Darren Waller as well. He feels to me
This is the big one.
Like a really interesting thought experiment is going to happen because it was Joe Schoen who traded for Darren Waller and gave up that third round draft pick to be able to get him. If you cut him now and you got half a season of half injured, half production for a third round pick, that would look like a huge miss for Joe Schoen. So you don't want to have the sunken cost fallacy where you're like, oh well, we already invested a third round pick, so we have to keep him. But at the same time, Joe Schoen has a very difficult decision. Darren Waller has a cap hit of $14 million, and the Giants can basically save about half of that if they were to let Darren Waller go. And the question is, what could the Giants do roster-wise with an additional $7 million if they decide not to bring back Darren Waller? To me, that's such a big number. And what's your immediate reaction, Adam, as to whether or not you think Darren Waller is going to be here next season?
I think he will be here next season because I don't think that Joe Schoen has the appetite to take the dead cap hit. That being said, if you add that in to the Mark Glowinski decision, which, by the way, okay, the Darren Waller piece, if you move off of him, then you can maybe make a more palatable case about wanting to keep Saquon Barkley and being able of keeping Saquon Barkley. And you're going to try to make a decision about Xavier McKinney. Maybe Mark Glowinski and Darius Slayton and Darren Waller become the sacrificial lambs to get you $21 million, $22 million to start to go after and retain Xavier McKinney and Saquon Barkley. I don't know if that's in totality the right answer. I think that they should highly consider moving on from Waller, and it's mostly the injury concerns. Because again, $14 million, it's like the same thing with Daniel Jones, right? Whether it's $15 million last year or $47 million this year, it's only relative to being productive and being healthy and on the field. So if there's a risk that $14 million is going to convert to another half season for a tight end position in a wide receiver room that needs some veteran talent there for sure, if not an elite level draft talent as well, I find it really hard to kind of rest on it and say, okay, Wan'Dale Robinson has some early career injury concerns too. Jalen Hyatt, second-year wide receiver. You guys are now the relied upon here. The interesting thing, to be a little long-winded, and I do want to get back to Glowinski, is that there's a part of this that feeds back into what I think was always Joe Schoen's original premise when he took the GM spot. There's a lot of work to do here. This roster needs a lot of rebuilding. There's a world where they're like, yeah, another developmental year for our third-year wide receiver, our second-year wide receiver. And in our minds, internally, we're talking about a year from now. Again, we're not talking about going out and being high competitive this season.
But Joe Schoen is the one that paid Daniel Jones the money. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe in Daniel Jones still. I think if healthy, he can be a productive player for the
Sure.
Giants. But Joe Schoen did pay him, and knowing all of those injury risks, Joe Schoen did trade a third-round draft pick for an often injured Darren Waller. Like, these are not surprises that these players are getting hurt. And the issue that I have, Adam, around all of this is just thinking at big picture, high level right now. You talk about having 25 million in cap space, right? If you decide to keep Darren Waller and you have to re-sign Xavier McKinney and Saquon Barkley, the Giants don't have money to go improve the team outside of the draft. That's the biggest challenge that I see here.
Well, so okay, so real quick on Darren Waller too, and this also ties to Daniel Jones, and it also ties to what could be. You could tell me I'm wearing a tinfoil hat right now. Darren Waller's contract has an out after this season, 2 years, 23 million. So unlikely he gets moved because you're not going to take dead cap just to get off of a player 1 year sooner. When a year from now you're totally clean. Daniel Jones also contract has the out, so they can walk away 100% clean. A massive injury clause inside of that contract that gets fully guaranteed money in Daniel Jones' pocket. That's to be very concerning for the New York Football Giants as well. But the fact that after this upcoming season, they can be out from underneath Daniel Jones, they can be out from underneath Darren Waller, it again continues to paint a picture of an organization and a GM that was like, hey, we're going to try to sell a little something here. Yeah, it's going to look pretty brutal if I'm paying $47 million to Daniel Jones, but relative to where we think our timeline is, it's not that big of a deal because in 2025, we have all this money and potentially an interesting decision that they're going to make in this draft. Last note here that I will say, it's the other reason why I'm interested to know about Mark Glowinski. Because yes, he was absolutely brutal, and then maybe he wasn't the starter, then he kind of was the starter, and then they shuffled him around a bit, and he did play better by whatever standard on the back end of the season than he did at the beginning. I don't know for sure. Like you and I've been assuming Mark Glowinski's definitely gone. Are we 100% sure of that? Just understanding that unless they have the clear, you mentioned Robert Hunt from Miami. Hey, if we're going and getting Robert Hunt, then yes, we're going to make this move. But what if they can't get him? What if Miami keeps him, right? What if the market does not have the better option in the Giants' eyes? Are they going to cut a veteran guard for whatever he is or is not, and then say, McCarthy, right? We're going to start looking into some of the young guys that are unproven as well and say, now you guys have to serve this role, or put an absolute impetus on the offensive line being this critical draft situation for the Giants. Like, I start to have these weird moments here where I keep thinking, maybe it's just patience and let a lot of these contracts just clear without taking on dead cap hits.
You know what's interesting? As you were talking about that, I was like, "Oh man, we're gonna trot out Mark Glowinski again next season, aren't we?" Is that what Adam's saying? But it actually makes me think that there's a path number 3 with Mark Glowinski that Joe Schoen is going to explore, and
Okay.
that is, "Hey, Mark, come into my office. We just have to have a little chat. We're going to need you to restructure your contract and
Right.
take the veteran minimum. That's what we're going to need from you if you want to stick around and stay here." And Glowinski's going to look around and say, "Well, the film that I put out there doesn't really probably warrant me getting a multi-year deal from another team." Like, isn't there a world where you could potentially lower Glowinski's cap hit if he agrees to stick around and still free up that $3 or $4 million?
Of course, yeah, and maybe that is a part of it, right? Because if you're Glowinski, you're saying, where am I getting a better deal, right? So all things being equal, what if I just want to let this play itself out, right? Like, what if I just want to say, thanks so much, this has been great, and you go to free agency and nobody really bites at it, and I'm here, I'm comfortable. Why be worried about making the move? Sure, and we've seen this, right? We saw this with Sterling Shepard. I don't know if Glowinski views himself in the same light that Shepard does. He doesn't have his long, lengthy injury history that's kind of plagued him, but it's certainly decisions that the Giants have to make. The bottom line being, whether they make those moves around these players, you're talking about a key decision with Darren Waller that could free up 14 million, free up, with dead cap split, but it still is the cap number is going to be freed up. The dead money doesn't impact that. 7 more million on Glowinski, 8 million on Darius Slayton, which I think is a really hard one because we've said time and time again that we like him as a receiver. Maybe it's a little more expensive than you want to spend, but you need to have that guy there. He had a really good year a season ago, and the dead cap number is low enough. And if you want to make another move, all of a sudden you start nipping at the heels. That's the way the Giants get themselves north of $40 million in cap space to make the difficult decisions around a Saquon Barkley, around an Xavier McKinney, and around other free agents, right? Looking outside the building and saying, hey, if we want to go get somebody, we're going to need to be a little bit more flexible here. Ultimately, before we talk about another interesting draft-related note on one J.J. McCarthy, where do you stand on what you think Joe Schoen looks at this roster and sees? Does he see a team ready to be 2 years ago, competitive, sniffing the playoffs? Or do you think that they're actually on the track of, yep, we knew this was going to be a multi-year rebuild. We actually kind of outkicked the coverage in our first season, and we're coming back to neutral here and understanding we had to rebuild this thing from the ground up?
I'm curious. I mean, it's a great question. It's like a funny thing happened in winning that game in Minnesota in the playoffs. It kind of made everyone bring the band back together and try to see if we
Bit of
could
a
build
curse.
upon whatever we did before. And that clearly imploded last season. And it's like, are we going to try to reinvest that same way, knowing that Daniel Jones now has all of that money in that cap space? I I am fearful that we are in for one more rough season before we can really have a lot of turnover on the roster. And when you
Yeah.
talk about all these different cap hits, Adam, like when you think about who some of the most expensive cap hits are for the Giants, obviously you have Daniel Jones up there because you decided to pay the quarterback. Then the next ones are Andrew Thomas, Dexter Lawrence, Darren Waller, and Bobby Okereke,
Yep.
right? All impactful players for the Giants. But as you start moving past that, you've got Mark Glowinski and Evan Neal and Nunez Roche and Jamie Gillen. Like it starts to fall off pretty quickly in terms of the talent level and like the foundational pieces that you could build around. And to me, that's the fundamental problem with this team, Adam, is that there is no depth. And like once you get off of some of our really good players, it feels like you're talking about literally replacement level players occupying positions at starting positions for the New
Yeah.
York Giants.
Yep. And that's why I think this offseason is fascinating. I think the draft becomes fascinating for the Giants, and it brings us to a interesting wrinkle over the course of this offseason. We kind of alluded to this a couple episodes ago, but I want to drill down on a little bit deeper because some things have updated around this. So we've long since said whether or not you think the Giants should get a quarterback, there's been some rumblings. The Giants could be one of the teams to move up here. I just feel like a lot of the guys at the top of the draft, when we talk, obviously, about the Caleb Williams, the Mays, the Daniels of the world, that the top teams of the draft are also going to sit there and say, we want these guys, whether it's the Bears, the Commanders, the Patriots, even the Cardinals, when we talk about wide receivers and we get into that room, right? So now all of a sudden, though, it comes out in the last like 10 days or so that J.J. McCarthy is perceived by NFL teams and by NFL scouts and GMs to be far higher on the board than most people outside, than fans, and than other pundits would believe. Originally, he's a second round pick. Maybe some teams say we're going to sneak into the back. We talked about, would you sneak in the back of the first round, get fifth year option on J.J. McCarthy? Now, if you go over on Tankathon following kind of this breaking news around one J.J. McCarthy, 12th overall to the Denver Broncos is where he gets projected. And if you walk up the board until you get to sixth pick with the Giants, the Vikings at 11, yeah, they could be in the market for a QB. The Jets win now mode, but they do need to have the future in place after Aaron Rodgers. Not going to be the Bears, assuming they go with Caleb May. The Falcons took a third round. Desmond Ridder could be in the market. And then you have the Titans before you get to the Giants at 6. There is no world where the move back into the first round and get J.J. McCarthy exists anymore. Now it's about, there's not even a trade back scenario if you're the Giants and you want to get a quarterback. How much are you willing to put stock in the rising stock of J.J. McCarthy, a quarterback that has a lot of nice measurables? There's a one key stat I want to get to about him. And he's also a QB that in most of his college games, he's 150 to 220 kind of yards a game kind of guy, right? Like he doesn't have all the flashy stats that you might want to have in a top 10 QB.
Yeah, so listen, he's 6'3", 210, 220. He's got good size for an NFL quarterback. What I do like about JJ McCarthy is also he was a 4-star recruit coming out of high school. So like he had the skill set
Right,
there.
pedigree.
And
Yep.
then yes, he went to Michigan and obviously they were a run the ball first, play really great defense type of team under Jim Harbaugh. So maybe you didn't necessarily get to see all of the skill sets that JJ McCarthy has. So I do think that he's an interesting one because it feels like there is untapped potential with JJ McCarthy. My issue is very simple. We just mentioned some of the cap hits that the Giants have. And as you get out of the first 3 or 4 guys that are the most expensive for the Giants, you feel like the production of the players kind of falls off. The Giants need more depth across the entire roster. And I don't necessarily know if JJ McCarthy, solves that problem. If the Giants were to trade back from 6 and get multiple first round picks and get a second round pick and be able to actually build this roster out accordingly with high end talent, that to me seems like the more prudent way to do this. But again, I've said it to you before. If Joe Schoen really believes in someone like JJ McCarthy and that is the new plan that they want to go with, then so be it. Like we can't just because we spent money on Daniel Jones, we can't be beholden to the fact that he either is or isn't the quarterback. It's up to Joe Schoen to decide at this point. Has he seen enough? Does he want to invest a first round pick and completely reset the clock?
And that's a big part of it, right? And we've long since said this, like, you don't have to go up and trade for one of the top quarterbacks because you feel like you need to get one. If you think that one of those guys is a franchise level, a transcendent, right, a game-changing quarterback for your team, of course you'll get him, right? If you think the next Patrick Mahomes is sitting there in the mix, of course you go get that guy. You see how valuable it can be. But you don't have to, as you and I say, feel like you need to mortgage everything to move up the board. And that's what makes McCarthy fascinating to me. After you get past, so it's a 6'1" Caleb Williams. Talk about size. I think that matters, obviously, relative to the way that Brian Daboll wants his quarterbacks to use themselves, like Josh Allen, even like Daniel Jones, in spite of some of the injuries. One thing about JJ McCarthy is he's tall, 6'3", but he's not exactly big in terms of being 210-ish kind of weight class. But when you talk about a couple of key things, first of all, Penix Jr. and Nix, when you go over to Tankathon now, they have dropped all the way out of the first round, even though they're regarded as being among the top 5 quarterbacks in this draft class. It seems like the combine will play a massive role in these guys resetting themselves. But you got to go down to 42 for Bo Nix with the Vikings, as we mentioned them in the top of the draft, and then 43, the Falcons, Michael Penix Jr., right? So 2 teams that want quarterbacks but choose to wait into the second round in order to get that done. The other thing about JJ McCarthy, though, is a 4.6 40. That 40 time after the top, Caleb Williams 4.59, 4.60 for May, 4.50 for Jaden Daniels. He is the fastest quarterback remaining after those 340 times. So again, scrambling, using his legs, mobility, the mold of quarterback is right. I think as long as you can tell me, if you are Joe Schoen, I believe that JJ McCarthy is marginally within the Jaden Daniels territory. I'm not saying he is, but like, if that's what we believe, then why wouldn't I just sit there at 6, right? Now you have to be fearful about a team making a move up here and now getting ahead of you for this new top quarterback, apparently. So you still have that risk, but I think it's favorable to be able to let this guy fall to you at 6. And to your point about all the other needs, I get it. But again, we're only a year away from clearing $50+ million off this cap and being able to have an influx of talent to help this then second-year quarterback really thrive early in his career.
Yeah, the last question I have for you in regards to JJ McCarthy is,
Okay.
how confident are you that he's better than Daniel Jones?
Uh, well, like right now, you mean like walking in the door week 1 starting over Daniel Jones? Like he comes in camp and he can win the job? Is that the question?
Well, it's just more of like a philosophical question. Like if you go get Caleb Williams or you go get Drake May,
Right.
who
You feel
like
like
has these intangibles, the size, like you're like, okay, this is our guy for the future. If you get JJ McCarthy, like if you're asking me, like I can't definitively tell you that he is going to be a better quarterback than Daniel Jones, and so that scares me into making one of those types of selections. I don't know if that
Sure.
goes into your thought process, but like if the Giants draft, well, let's say the Giants wait until mid-second round and they draft Bo
Oh,
Nix.
Knicks. Right.
Like,
Right. Yeah.
how does that inspire you? Is he immediately better than Daniel Jones? I kind of get the same feeling once you get out of the first handful of quarterbacks that are available, that it's just not as clear cut with some of these other guys, and it almost muddies the water even more.
Well, the difference to me would be that so it's like, oh, are you more confident in JJ McCarthy or Bo Nix or Michael Penix Jr. than you are in Daniel Jones? Well, it's really not about him anymore. It's just like I'm not confident in Daniel Jones. And I'm not confident in Daniel Jones that whatever he does this season when he's healthy, that it's going to change. Like he probably has to have this team has to go back to the playoffs. Like, or short of that, he needs to be a top 15, top 14 in terms of statistical categories. Like he would have to do something pretty impressive in order for the Giants to say, and now we're committed to the next 2 years of this contract, right? Because that changes the entire trajectory and plan of your organization. If you say, we're going to go pot committed on the back end of the 4-year, $160 million contract for Daniel Jones. Now, in theory, if that were the case, then you talk about extending him even more, and then you spread out the money, right? And you start to be able to do some things a little more flexibly. But I just cannot, again, we talked about this at the time, no franchise gives the quarterback that they believe is the franchise quarterback a 4-year deal with a lot of money that has a 2-year out. Nobody does it. No one has ever done that with a franchise quarterback. They lock them up for massive deals, right, wrong, indifferent. Some of them work out, some of them don't. But no organization is like, gosh, I'm so confident in you that 2 years from now, I'd like to be able to walk away clean. And that's why I believe that that's where this is headed no matter what. So if you think that McCarthy can be that guy, if he's 80% of what Daniel Jones is right now today, you believe that he can be 120% of him a year later. So I'm comfortable making the decision. I think what becomes fascinating is, when do you just bench your $47 million quarterback so that your rookie gets some reps? I think that would be the immediate start of the conversation. If the Giants take a top 6 quarterback in this draft, they pick 6 and they take J.J. McCarthy. If Daniels fell to them, he's not going to, and they took him. If they moved up and got a quarterback, the clock immediately starts ticking for when is this guy going to start, because he's the new franchise quarterback. Make no bones about it. Doesn't matter who it is, whether you love him or hate him, he's the new quarterback, and Daniel Jones is effectively done as the Giants franchise QB. Maybe it opens up some opportunity for make an interesting decision when it comes to trade deadlines and injuries and other stuff.
It'll be fascinating to see. You've heard the reports that the Giants are more interested in bringing in a potential veteran quarterback rather than maybe spending the 6th pick overall on a quarterback. And yeah, the one other thing I'll say is, if the Giants select a quarterback at 6, you're also kind of wasting a year of having a cheap quarterback on the roster because Daniel Jones is making so much money. So it's like you almost want to be able to get out from Daniel Jones to be able to get that quarterback next year to be able to build around him like they've done in San Francisco.
Right. And you'd say, 6th overall, we talk about neighbors. Can you get an elite wide receiver that in the following year, your rookie quarterback already has a guy established, right? There's a lot of key decisions there. And one last footnote, by the way, if you go 6 and you take a quarterback, you're not getting a veteran quarterback in the door at that point in free agency, because it really doesn't make any sense. Daniel Jones is the, quote, veteran quarterback. And if he's not well enough to play, then guess what? Tommy DeVito, you may be starting the first game of the season if the rookie isn't ready yet, right? So they would change that hierarchy as well, which I think is fascinating, because if you want to win football games now, you go get a Gardner Minshew and you say he starts the season. If he looks better than Daniel Jones, sorry, Daniel, you won't be here next year. But if you go with the rookie, the narrative is set. We are in a rebuild mode now, and then you make a lot of different decisions. And by the way, follow the breadcrumbs this offseason. The choices that they make with some of the other players we talk about are going to relate back to the decision they're going to make in the draft potentially, especially when it comes to free agency as well. That being the case, we still have to clear out. There's 90% of this roster that won't be here going into the offseason, going into free agency. We'll start to highlight where we think our best path forward would be for the Giants in the offseason to set up the most successful draft possible for this team to win in the short and long term. Until then, though, we'll tell you a couple of things. One, you can get over to YouTube at One Giant Podcast, see our beautiful faces over on the podcast feeds, wherever you get those needs fulfilled. You get us on Twitter at AndyMac214, at Adam Armbrecht, and at One Giant Podcast. And you also head on over to Personam. Personam, as we love to tell you, is always vigilant, always learning. It is the only network threat detection engine your security operations center needs. It can simply detect threats that other platforms and tools cannot. You get over to Personam, Personam, and get your network secure today. But until next time, as we continue the offseason, the official offseason conversation for Big Blue, as Andrew Mackwitz would want, need, and nay, demand that people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.